In the scorched earth of the Arizona Territory, where mercy was a currency scarcer than water, a single act of kindness gave birth to a legend. It was a legend whispered in hushed tones around campfires, and in the smoky corners of saloons, the name of a man who was more ghost than flesh, a phantom of vengeance who haunted the powerful and the cruel. But what no one knew was that this fearsome spectre, this man who had become the most feared in the West, was born from a dying boy's last breath in the arms of a woman. This is the story of Isabella Rossi and the Apache warrior she nursed back from the dead, the man who would stain the desert red for his people, and for her, his only love. The year was 1878. The air in the San Simon Valley of the Arizona Territory was a physical thing, a thick, shimmering blanket of heat that smelled of dust, creosote, and the distant promise of a monsoon that never seemed to arrive. For Isabella Rossi, the world had shrunk to the boundaries of her father's small, hard-won homestead. It was a world of mending fences, tending to the meager garden that fought the sun daily, and listening to the perpetual rasping cough that signaled her father, Jedediah, was losing his own battle with the unforgiving land. Isabella was not the delicate flower some Eastern papers depicted frontier women as. She was 20, with hands calloused from work and skin kissed brown by a sun that had long since bleached any hint of her Italian mother's olive complexion. Her mother Maria had passed 2 years prior, leaving behind a legacy of resilience and a deep knowledge of herbal remedies, a knowledge that was now Isabella's most prized possession. It was on a blistering August afternoon, while searching for the elusive feverfew herb along a dried-up creek bed, that she found him. At first, she thought he was a bundle of discarded rags, or perhaps a dead coyote. But as she drew closer, the shape resolved into that of a man lying face down in the cracked mud. An Apache. His buckskin leggings were torn and stained dark with blood, and a deep, ragged gash ran from his shoulder, down his back swarming with black flies. Every instinct, every warning from her father and their few neighbors screamed at her to run. The Chiricahua Apache were ghosts of the mountains, locked in a brutal war with the U.S. Army and settlers alike. To be found near one, let alone a wounded one, was a death sentence. They were spoken of as savages, inhuman specters of violence. But as she stood over him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, she saw the slight, almost imperceptible rise and fall of his chest. He was young, no older than her, his long black hair matted with blood and dirt. Maria Rossi's voice echoed in her memory, a gentle but firm command from her childhood. There is no sin in healing, Isabella. The body does not care what language the soul speaks. With a strength born of desperation and a defiant compassion, she made her choice. Getting him back to the homestead was a Herculean task. He was lean but wiry with muscle and completely unconscious. She used her shawl as a makeshift travois, dragging him inch by painful inch across the half-mile of unforgiving terrain. Every scrape of rock, every rustle in the scrub brush sent a jolt of terror through her. If her father's neighbor, the prying and suspicious Silas Croft, were to see this, he would have the rangers here before sundown. She managed to get him into the small, cool barn, laying him on a bed of fresh hay in a hidden corner behind the empty stalls. Jedediah was confined to his bed, his breathing too shallow to notice her struggle. For the next 3 days, Isabella lived a double life. By day, she was the dutiful daughter, tending to her father, cooking, cleaning her face, a mask of weary calm. By night, she was a secret healer. She cleaned the warrior's wounds with boiled water and poultices of yarrow to stop the bleeding, and crushed juniper leaves to fight infection. He was burning with fever, his body racked with shivers despite the oppressive heat. In his delirium he muttered words in a language she didn't understand the sounds, guttural and filled with pain. She trickled water between his parched lips and held him down during his violent trembles. On the third night the fever broke. She was wiping his brow with a damp cloth when his eyes flickered open. They were not the wild, hate-filled eyes of a savage she had been warned about. They were dark, deep, and shockingly clear, holding a mixture of confusion, pain, and a guarded intelligence that took her breath away. He tried to raise his hand, instinctively going for a knife that wasn't there. Easy. Isabella whispered, her voice barely a breath. She held up her empty hands. You are safe. I mean you no harm. He stared at her, his gaze intense, searching. He didn't understand her words, but he seemed to understand her tone. He saw the medicine bowl in her hand, the clean bandages on his back. He slowly relaxed his head, falling back onto the hay. He watched her every move as she applied a fresh poultice, his silence, a heavy, unnerving presence in the dusty air. He had the sharp, aquiline features of his people, a face that looked as if it were carved from the red rock of the canyons themselves. It was a face built for hardship, yet in the soft lantern light she could see a vulnerability he fought to conceal. She learned his name was not a name at all, but a description whispered in his fever dreams, Tazako. She couldn't pronounce it properly, so in the quiet of her own mind, she began to call him Kale. It felt solid, like the man of quiet strength she was beginning to see. Their communication was a thing of gestures and shared glances. A nod for water, a raised eyebrow when she brought him broth, a slow, deliberate blink of thanks. The secret was a living thing, a dangerous creature she harbored in her barn. And she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that this single act of mercy had set her on a path from which there was no turning back. The days bled into weeks. Kale's strength returned with a startling swiftness that spoke of a body honed by a life of relentless hardship. He was soon able to sit up, then stand his movements fluid and silent as a mountain cat's. The barn became their sanctuary, a world unto itself sealed off by the slant of the afternoon sun through the wooden slats. In that small, hay-scented space, the barriers between their worlds began to dissolve. Isabella would bring him his meals, and instead of leaving immediately, she would linger. She taught him words in English, pointing to objects, and speaking their names slowly. Water, bread, blanket. He was a quick study, his mind sharp and retentive. He would repeat the words, his voice, a low baritone, the foreign sounds rolling carefully off his tongue. In turn, he taught her. He showed her how to read the signs of the land in ways she'd never imagined, how the curl of a leaf could predict rain, how the tracks of a lizard could lead to hidden water. He drew maps in the dirt with a stick, showing her the secret paths through the Dragoon Mountains paths, known only to the Chiricahua. He spoke of his people not as the bloodthirsty demons of settler nightmares, but as a nation fighting for their home, for their very existence. He used a mixture of his own tongue, broken English, and expressive gestures. He spoke of a leader named Geronimo, a man of fire and spirit, and of the relentless pressure from the Inder, the White Eyes. Isabella found herself captivated. This was not a savage. This was a man of deep intelligence, fierce pride, and a sorrow that ran as deep as the canyons he described. She saw the pain in his eyes when he spoke of his family, a wife and young son he'd been separated from during an army ambush, the very ambush that had left him for dead. He was trying to get back to them, to a stronghold in the Sierra Madre of Mexico. A fragile intimacy grew between them, woven from shared secrets and the quiet hum of the ever-present danger. Sometimes a shared glance would last a moment too long. A brush of their hands as she passed him a bowl of stew would send a jolt through her. She was drawn to his quiet intensity, the way he watched the world with an unwavering focus. He in turn seemed mesmerized by her. He would watch her as she worked, his dark eyes tracing her movements with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something more complex. The danger, however, was closing in. Silas Croft, a neighboring rancher, who had made his unwelcome intentions toward Isabella clear since her mother's passing, began to visit more frequently. He was a man with small, suspicious eyes and a cruel twist to his lips. He would bring offerings a scrawny chicken or a bit of venison, using them as an excuse to linger his gaze crawling over Isabella. "Your father Jedediah, he's not long for this world," Isabella Silas said one afternoon, leaning against the porch rail as if he owned it. "A woman alone out here. It's not safe. You'll need a man to protect you, to protect this land." His insinuations made her skin crawl, but it was his growing suspicion that terrified her. "I've been seeing 2 sets of tracks down by the creek," he'd commented idly, his eyes narrowed. "And I could have sworn I heard a voice from your barn the other night. You keeping secrets, Isabella?" She had deflected with a nervous laugh, blaming it on a traveling peddler. But she knew her time was running out. Cale knew it too. He had seen Silas from the cracks in the barn wall, his body tense, his hand resting on the handle of the small skinning knife Isabella had given him to carve wood. "He is a snake," Cale said one evening, his English now more fluid. "He looks at you with hunger." "Not of the heart. He wants this land," Isabella replied, her voice low. "My father is weak. He thinks he can force me out or force me to marry him." "I must go," Cale said, his gaze fixed on her. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and unwelcome. "I stay. I bring death to this house. To you." Isabella's heart clenched. The thought of the barn falling silent, of him being gone, was an ache she hadn't anticipated. "You're not strong enough yet." "Your back." "It is strong enough," he insisted gently. He reached out his fingers, hesitating for a moment, before they lightly touched a loose strand of her hair. It was the first time he had touched her with such tenderness. The contact was electric, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken feelings that had taken root in the shadows of the barn. "You saved my life, Isabella Rossi. I will not be the cause of your death." The night of his departure was starless, the moon a faint sliver hidden by clouds. He was dressed in a spare set of clothes she had patched for him, a small satchel of dried meat and a full canteen slung over his shoulder. They stood by the barn door, the chirping of crickets filling the tense silence. "I have nothing to give you," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely showed. He reached into a small pouch at his waist and pulled out a single perfectly shaped eagle feather tied with a thin strip of leather. "For my people, this is a sign of strength, of honor, of a debt that must be repaid." He pressed it into her hand. "Keep it. One day I will return what I owe you." "You owe me nothing, Cale," she whispered, her fingers closing around the feather. Her throat was tight with unshed tears. He looked at her, then a long, deep look that seemed to drain all the air from her lungs. He saw the fear in her eyes, the sorrow and the affection she could no longer hide. Before she could react, he leaned in and pressed his lips to hers. It was not a rough, demanding kiss, but one of surprising gentleness, tasting of dust, desperation, and a profound, heart-breaking farewell. It was over as quickly as it began. "Wait for the sign of the soaring hawk," he murmured against her ear. When you see it, know that I am free." And then he was gone. He didn't walk into the darkness. He dissolved into it, as silent and ephemeral as a shadow. Isabella stood there for a long time, clutching the eagle feather, the ghost of his kiss on her lips, staring into the empty night that had swallowed the only man who had ever truly seen her. 5 years is a lifetime in the West. For Isabella it was an eternity of dust and silence. Her father Jedediah passed away a year after Cale's departure, leaving her truly alone. Silas Croft's advances grew bolder, more menacing, but Isabella, armed with a newfound core of iron Cale had unknowingly forged in her, met his threats with a cold defiance and a loaded shotgun kept by her door. She held on to her land with a tenacity that baffled and infuriated her neighbors. The small homestead was her only connection to the past, to her parents, and to the memory of the man in her barn. The eagle feather was her most treasured possession. She kept it pressed within the pages of her mother's Bible. Some nights she would take it out and run her fingers along its smooth vein, wondering if Cale had ever made it to the Sierra Madre, if he had found his family, if he was even still alive. She scanned the skies for soaring hawks, but the sky remained stubbornly, achingly empty. During those 5 years, the Arizona Territory festered. The Apache Wars raged on a bloody symphony of raids, reprisals, and broken treaties. But then a new name began to surface, a name spoken in fearful whispers by soldiers, settlers, and Apaches alike. They called him El Espectro, the Ghost. He was not like the other warriors. He did not lead large war parties. He moved alone, or with a handful of shadows, striking with surgical precision, not at homesteads or stagecoaches, but at the very heart of the corruption that was strangling the territory. He targeted the supply lines of the U.S. Army units, known for their brutality. He raided the mines of wealthy syndicates who used slave labor. He dismantled the operations of cattle barons who were driving Mexican and small American ranchers off their ancestral lands. His methods were as terrifying as they were effective. He used fear as a weapon, leaving behind chilling signs, a single black arrow, a specific chilling bird call that echoed through a canyon just before an attack. He never harmed women or children, a detail that only added to his mystique. But the men he targeted were often found with their throats cut, their bodies left as a warning. He was a phantom, a righteous demon, and the bounty on his head, dead or alive, climbed to an astronomical sum. No one knew his real name, his face, or where he came from. He was simply the ghost of the dragoons. Isabella heard the stories, of course. In the town of Prescott, where she traveled twice a year for supplies, his name was on everyone's lips. Some called him a savage murderer. Others, the downtrodden and the dispossessed, spoke of him as a savior. Isabella felt a strange, detached admiration for this phantom, a man who fought for those with no one else to fight for them. She never, not for a moment, connected the feared El Espectro to the wounded, quiet man she had known as Cale. The boy she had nursed was a survivor, a man trying to get back to his family. The ghost was an angel of death. The truth was far darker. Cale had made it to the Sierra Madre, but what he found there had shattered him. He found the smoldering remains of his camp, the result of a raid by Mexican scalp hunters paid by the state government. His wife, his son, they were gone, their names now just whispers on the wind. The man Isabella had saved died in that moment in the ashes of his life. In his place, something else was born. He was no longer just Tazako. He was a man hollowed out by grief and filled with a cold, clear purpose. He returned to Arizona, not just as a Chiricahua warrior, but as something more. He used the English Isabella had taught him to listen in towns to learn the inner workings of his enemies. He used the survival skills of his people and a strategic brilliance all his own to become an instrument of vengeance. The name El Espectro was given to him by the Mexicans. He first targeted the ones who traded in Apache scalps. He embraced it. He became the fear they had sowed. His small band of warriors were a collection of the broken and the vengeful Apache who had lost everything, disillusioned Mexicans, even a former buffalo soldier who had seen too much injustice. They were loyal to him not because of his tribe, but because of his vision to break the machine of greed that was chewing up the land and its people, regardless of their skin color. And in the darkest hours of the night, when the weight of his actions pressed down on him, when the faces of the men he'd killed haunted his sleep, the only thing that brought him a sliver of peace was the memory of a woman with gentle hands and defiant eyes, a woman who smelled of herbs and kindness. He wondered if she was safe, if she had survived. He told himself he could never go back, that the man she had known was dead, and the monster he had become would only bring her ruin. He had a debt to repay her, but he believed the only way to do so was to stay away, to keep his world of blood and shadows from ever touching hers again. But the West had a way of shrinking, of drawing disparate threads together into a single tangled knot, and the quiet life of Isabella Rossi was about to be pulled into the violent legend of El Espectro. The catalyst for the collision was a man named Baxter Thorne. Thorne was a new kind of power in the West, a cattle baron from back east with a portfolio of investors, a private army of hired guns, and a charter from the railroad. He wasn't just a rancher. He was an industrialist of the plains. His Bar Tea Ranch was expanding like a cancer swallowing smaller homesteads through intimidation, legal chicanery, and brute force. Isabella's small plot of land, with its modest but reliable well, sat directly in the path of Thorne's planned southern grazing expansion. To him, her homestead was a worthless speck of dust, but her well was a jewel. He wanted it. His campaign started subtly. A few of Isabella's cattle went missing. A section of her fence was torn down, allowing Thorne's massive herd to trample her garden. Then came the visits from Thorne's foreman, a sneering man named Cutter. "Mr. Thorne is prepared to make you a generous offer for this property," Cutter had said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Isabella's boots. $500, more than this dust bowl is worth. "It's not for sale." Isabella had replied, her hand resting on the stock of the shotgun, leaning against the doorframe. Cutter laughed. "That's a mistake, ma'am. A lonely woman like you. Accidents happen out here." The threats escalated. One night a fire was set in her hayloft, the very barn where she had nursed Cale. She managed to put it out before it consumed the whole structure, but the message was clear. She was terrified, but the thought of giving up, of letting men like Thorne and Cutter win, stoked the embers of her defiance into a hot flame. She was her mother's daughter, and she was the woman who had hidden an Apache warrior from the world. She would not break. Desperate, she traveled to Prescott to file a complaint with the territorial marshal. The marshal, a man on Thorne's payroll, dismissed her claims with a patronizing smile. "Mom, sounds like a dispute between neighbors. I'm sure you and Mr. Thorne can work it out." It was in Prescott, feeling utterly defeated, that she heard the whispers again, but this time she listened with a different ear. Two Mexican farmers, their faces etched with worry, were talking in low tones in the general store about how Thorne's men had tried to divert their creek. "And then last night the ghost struck," one said in Spanish. "All of Thorne's equipment at the dam site sabotaged. 2 of his guards left, tied up, stripped naked, with a black arrow pinned to their clothes. Thorn is furious. A seed of a desperate idea began to sprout in Isabella's mind. The ghost El Espectro was a killer, an outlaw, but he was the only justice to be found in a land where the law had been bought and sold. He was a dark hope, but he was the only hope she had left. She didn't know how to contact a phantom, but she remembered the stories. She remembered the farmers and ranchers he had protected. She began asking careful questions not about him directly, but about the families on the losing end of Thorn's expansion. She found her way to a small, devout Mexican family whose shrine to a local saint was a known place for leaving messages, prayers for the hopeless. It was said that a prayer left there for deliverance sometimes found its way to the ears of the ghost. With a trembling hand, she wrote a note. She didn't offer money. She had little to give. Instead, she offered a trade. She wrote of her small plot of land, of Baxter Thorn's aggression, and of the well he coveted. And then she made her offer. I am a healer. I have knowledge of herbs and medicines that can treat wounds and fevers the town doctors cannot. I offer this knowledge in exchange for aid. Leave a sign at the lone mesquite by the dried creek bed on the Rossi homestead if you will hear my plea. She signed it simply, A Woman Alone. She left the note at the shrine, tucked beside a flickering candle, feeling the foolishness and the desperation of her actions warring within her. She was asking a devil for help, pinning her survival on a ghost story. 200 miles away in a hidden canyon in the Dragoon Mountains, one of Cale's men, a young Apache boy named Nacho, brought him the note. The boy had been tasked with gathering intelligence near Prescott and had checked the shrine, as was their custom. Cale took the folded paper. The name Rossi struck him like a physical blow. It couldn't be. After all these years, it had to be a coincidence. But the description of the land, the lone mesquite, the dried creek bed, was an image seared into his memory. A woman alone. A healer. He unfolded the note. The handwriting was neat, precise. He read her plea, and the world seemed to slow down. The carefully controlled ice that had encased his heart for 5 years began to crack. Isabella. In trouble. Threatened by a man whose name, Baxter Thorn Cale, knew all too well. Thorn was one of the spiders at the center of the web of corruption he had been fighting. His men saw the change in him. The impenetrable mask of El Espectro slipped, revealing a flicker of raw, unguarded emotion. He had a debt to repay. He had promised. But going back meant risking everything. It meant bringing his world of death to her doorstep. To help her, he would have to haunt the one place on earth he had ever known peace. He looked at the note again, his thumb tracing her name. He had told himself he was dead, that the past was a foreign country. But the past was here in his hand, written in the ink of the only woman he had ever allowed to see, the man behind the warrior. His choice was already made. Nacho. He said, his voice quiet but charged with a new, dangerous energy. Saddle my horse. We ride north. Tell the others to be ready. We are going to war with Baxter Thorn. Cale moved with the cautious patience he had perfected over 5 years of war. He did not ride directly to Isabella's homestead. Instead, he became a true ghost circling the Bar T Ranch, observing Thorn's operations from the high ridges. He saw the sheer scale of Thorn's ambition, the number of armed riders, the miles of new barbed wire, the arrogance with which they treated the land. And he saw the pressure they were exerting on the small Rossi plot, a little island of defiance in Thorn's ever-expanding sea. He watched Isabella from a distance, using a brass spyglass he'd taken off a dead army captain. He saw her rebuilding the burnt section of the barn her movements determined. He saw her patrolling the perimeter of her land at dusk, shotgun in hand. She was older, leaner, but the same fire he remembered was there, burning even brighter. A fierce, protective feeling surged through him, an emotion he thought had been buried in the ashes of his past. He decided to help her from the shadows first, to honor the ghost's reputation, and keep his own identity hidden. His intervention was swift and brutal. One night, the pump for Thorne's primary well was expertly dismantled. Its crucial components vanished. A few nights later, a herd of 200 Bar T cattle were driven into a box canyon, their brands cleverly altered. The messages left behind were unmistakable, a single black arrow embedded in the well, housing a crudely drawn spectre on the canyon wall. Baxter Thorne was incensed. He was a man of cold logic and commerce, and this phantom was disrupting his balance sheets. He doubled the guards and sent Cutter with a final brutal warning to Isabella. Isabella was in the barn, mending a leather harness, when Cutter and 2 of his men rode in their horses, trampling her carefully tended vegetable patch. "That's it," Cutter snarled, dismounting and storming towards her. "No more games. Thorne wants you out. Now. I told you." Isabella said, her voice steady, despite the hammering in her chest. "This land is not for sale." Cutter laughed, a nasty, grating sound. "We're not buying it. We're taking it." He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in like talons. "Maybe after we burn this place to the ground, you'll be a little more cooperative." Suddenly a voice cut through the tense air, low and cold as a tombstone. "Let her go." Cutter and his men froze, spinning around. Standing at the edge of the tree line, not 50 yards away, was a lone figure. He was dressed in dark, dusty buckskins, a repeating rifle held loosely in one hand. His face was obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, but his presence was immense, radiating a lethal calm that was more terrifying than any overt threat. "Who the hell are you?" Cutter blustered his hand, dropping to the Colt at his hip. "I am the one you've been looking for," the figure said, taking a slow step forward into the sunlight. Cutter's bravado evaporated. He had heard the descriptions, the silent movement, the aura of death. "The ghost," he breathed. "You have one chance to ride out of here and never come back," the ghost said, his voice devoid of emotion. Pride and fear warred in Cutter's eyes. He made the wrong choice. He drew his pistol, but he was impossibly slow. The ghost's rifle was already at his shoulder. A single shot cracked through the afternoon stillness. It didn't hit Cutter, but splintered the wooden post right next to his head, sending a shard of wood stinging into his cheek. Cutter's 2 men, seeing the spectre of death before them, wanted no part of it. They spurred their horses and fled without a backward glance. Cutter stood frozen, trembling. The ghost took another step forward, and for the first time, Isabella could see his face clearly. It was a face she knew, yet didn't know. The sharp, aquiline features were the same, but they were harder now, etched with lines of grief and violence. His eyes, those dark, intelligent eyes, she remembered, held a chilling emptiness. A long, thin scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, a mark he hadn't had 5 years ago. He was focused entirely on Cutter. I said, "Let her go." Cutter shoved Isabella away and scrambled for his horse, hauling himself into the saddle and galloping off after his men. Silence descended thick and heavy. Isabella stared at the man before her, her mind reeling. The ghost. The famed killer. He had answered her plea. He slowly lowered his rifle and his gaze finally turned to her. In that moment, the cold mask of El Espectro faltered. His eyes, looking at her, lost their emptiness and were filled with a maelstrom of emotions, pain, regret, and a flicker of the gentle warmth she remembered. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. The scar, the eyes. It was impossible, but her heart knew before her mind could accept it. Cale. She whispered the name, a fragile thing in the tense air. His entire body went rigid. The sound of his name, spoken in her voice, after all these years, seemed to physically wound him. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The shotgun slipped from Isabella's numb fingers and clattered to the ground. The world tilted on its axis. The wounded boy she had healed and the most feared man in the West were one and the same. The shock was so profound it felt like a physical blow, followed by a dizzying wave of relief, joy, and a terrifying, bone-deep fear. "You," she stammered, taking a step towards him. "You came back. I had a debt to repay," he said, his voice hoarse. His eyes scanned her face, her homestead, the life she had built. "I should not have come. I bring nothing but death." "You saved my life," she said, her voice gaining strength. For now he countered his gaze, turning hard again, as he looked in the direction Cutter had fled. "Thorn will not let this go. He will send more men. Not just thugs, but killers. You are not safe here anymore. Not with me." He turned as if to leave, to melt back into the shadows that were his home. "No," Isabella cried out, moving quickly to stand in his path. "Don't you dare! You can't just appear like this, save me, and then vanish again. You are not a ghost, Cale. You are a man. I saved a man. Let me help him now." He stopped looking down at her. He saw not fear in her eyes, but a fierce, stubborn resolve that mirrored his own. He saw the woman who had defied every convention to save a hated enemy. And he saw the unspoken question that hung between them, a question of 5 lost years of unspoken feelings, of the boy he was and the monster he had become. For the first time in a long, long time, Kyle, the man they called the Ghost, did not know what to do. The days that followed were a strange and tense truce with reality. Cale did not leave. He couldn't. He knew Thorn would retaliate with overwhelming force, and the thought of leaving Isabella to face that alone was unconscionable. He became a shadow on her homestead, sleeping in the barn, his old sick room, and keeping a constant vigilant watch. For Isabella, living with the man who was both a memory and a terrifying legend was a dizzying experience. During the day she would see glimpses of the Cale she knew. He would watch her tend to her garden, his expression unreadable. He expertly repaired the barn door Cutter had damaged his hands, moving with a quiet competence. They fell into a strained routine, sharing meals in near silence. The chasm of the past 5 years, filled with blood and secrets, lay between them. At night, El Espectro emerged. He would disappear for hours, and Isabella would lie awake, listening to the sounds of the desert, her heart a cold knot of dread. He would return before dawn, silent, as smoke, his face grim, and she knew he had been out there waging his secret war. The attacks on Thorn's operations became more audacious. A payroll wagon was robbed the money later, turning up in the poor boxes of local churches. A shipment of repeating rifles vanished from a locked supply shed. Baxter Thorn was a man pushed to his limit. This ghost was not just a nuisance. He was a direct threat to his authority and his bottom line. He did what powerful men do. He bought a better monster. He sent a telegram to the Pinkerton National Detective Agency in Denver. The man who answered the call was Agent Sterling, a name spoken with grudging respect by outlaws and lawmen alike. Sterling was not a common thug for hire. He was a relentless, methodical manhunter, known for his keen intellect and his utter incorruptibility. The news of Sterling's arrival reached Cale through his network of whispers. He knew the game had changed. Sterling was not like the army patrols or Thorn's hired guns. He would hunt the man, not the myth. He would look for patterns, for motives for the human being inside the ghost. That night, Cale finally broke the silence that had grown between him and Isabella. They sat at a small wooden table, the light from a kerosene lamp casting long dancing shadows on the walls. "A man is coming," Cale said, his voice low. "A Pinkerton. His name is Sterling. He is not like the others. He is smart, and he does not stop." Isabella looked at his face, seeing the weariness in his eyes. "What will you do? I will lead him away from here. Draw him into the mountains. Lose him in the canyons, I know." He paused. "And you must leave. Go to Prescott. Or further. California. Thorn will not stop until he has this land, and now he will be looking for anyone connected to me." Isabella slammed her hand on the table, making the lamp flicker. "I am not running, Cale. I didn't run from Silas Croft. I didn't run from Baxter Thorn, and I am not running now. This is my home, and you are here because of my plea for help. Your war has become my war." He looked at her, a flicker of admiration warring with his frustration. "You do not understand what this war is. You heal. You create life. I take it. There is no place for you in my world." "Then maybe your world needs one." She shot back, her voice ringing with passion. "You cannot do this alone, Cale. You're one man against a Thorn's empire, and now this Pinkerton. You think like a warrior. You see targets and battlefields. But this is more than that. Sterling isn't looking for a warrior. He's looking for a man. He will look for your weaknesses, your past." Her eyes locked with his. "He will look for me." Her words hit him with the force of a physical blow. She was right. Sterling would not be fooled by ghost stories. He would investigate Thorn's enemies, and he would inevitably find his way to the defiant woman on the Rossi homestead. Her plea to the ghost was his only tangible link to the world, his one human connection. She was not a liability to be protected from a distance. She was now the center of the board. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm suggesting you stop treating me like the girl you left behind, and start treating me like an ally," she said, her tone softening. "You know how to fight, how to survive in the wild. I know people. I know how to listen. I know how to heal. Let me help you. We can't just fight Thorn's men. We have to expose him. We have to give this Agent Sterling a bigger villain to hunt than the ghost." For the first time, Cale saw a path forward that didn't end with him or Isabella in a grave. She offered not just comfort or a memory of the past, but a strategy, a way to fight a different kind of war. The alliance was forged. Their homestead became a war room. Isabella began making discreet trips to town, listening in the general store at the livery, talking to other ranchers squeezed by Thorn. She gathered information, shipping manifests, payroll schedules, disgruntled employees. She was his eyes and ears in the world he could no longer enter. Cale in turn taught her. He showed her how to move without a sound, how to use the land for cover, how to handle a pistol with deadly accuracy. The emotional chasm between them began to close, bridged by their shared purpose and the constant pressing danger. In the quiet moments, the old bond resurfaced stronger and more mature. He would watch her clean her rifle, her brow furrowed in concentration, and feel a love so fierce it terrified him. She would tend to a fresh cut on his arm, her touch gentle, and see past the killer to the wounded man she had once saved, the man who was still in there fighting. One evening, as they sat cleaning their weapons by the fire, she finally asked the question that had haunted her. "Your family, Cale. Did you ever find them?" The light in his eyes died. He stared into the flames, the silence stretching on for a full minute. When he spoke, his voice was raw. I found their graves. They were murdered. Not by soldiers. By men hunting for scalps. For money. Isabella's heart broke for him. She finally understood. The ghost wasn't born of hate for the settlers or the army. He was born of a love that had been stolen, a grief so profound it had been twisted into a terrible righteous fury. She reached out and laid her hand over his. He didn't pull away. "I am so sorry, Cale." He turned his hand and laced his fingers with hers, his grip tight, desperate. "The man they killed died with them, Isabella. What is left is what you see." "No," she whispered, moving closer, her gaze unwavering. "What I see is a man who has suffered more than anyone should. A man who fights for others because he couldn't save the ones he loved. I see the man I knew. And I am not afraid of him." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and the walls he had built around his heart for 5 long years crumbled into dust. He leaned in, and this time their kiss was not one of farewell. It was a kiss of homecoming of 2 broken souls finding their anchor in the storm. It was a desperate, hungry, and healing affirmation of life in the very shadow of death. They knew that their fragile happiness was measured in hours, that Agent Sterling was drawing closer every day, and that a final bloody reckoning was inevitable. But in that moment, under the vast, star-dusted Arizona sky, they were not a ghost and a homesteader. They were just a man and a woman, holding on to a love that had defied a war, a legend, and time itself. Agent Sterling was as good as his reputation. He arrived in Prescott, not with a posse, but with a notebook and a quiet, observant demeanor that unsettled everyone he spoke to. He spent a week meticulously interviewing Baxter Thorne, his foreman, the territorial marshal, and anyone who had ever had a run-in with the Bartee. He was polite, professional, and his pale blue eyes missed nothing. He quickly concluded that the ghost was not a random savage. The attacks were too precise, too strategic. This was a personal war, and as he dug deeper, one name kept surfacing at the edge of the conflict: Isabella Rossi, the woman whose homestead was the sole impediment to Thorne's expansion, the woman who, against all odds, was still there. He rode out to her homestead under the guise of a routine inquiry. Isabella met him on the porch, her heart pounding, but her face a mask of calm composure she had learned from Cale. Sterling was unassuming a man in a simple suit, looking more like a banker than a manhunter. "Miss Rossi," he began, tipping his hat. "I'm investigating the disturbances caused by this outlaw they call the Ghost. I understand you've had some trouble with Mr. Thorne. Mr. Thorne wants my land." "He's not a subtle man," Isabella replied coolly. Sterling nodded his eyes, scanning the property, noting the freshly repaired barn, the strategically cleared lines of sight from the house. "And the Ghost? Has he troubled you?" "He ran off some of Thorne's men who were trespassing," she said, choosing a partial truth. "I suppose I should be grateful." Sterling's gaze lingered on her for a moment. "It's curious," he said softly. "The Ghost has a reputation for being a ruthless killer. Yet with you he plays the part of a knight-errant. One might think there's a connection." Isabella held his gaze, her blood running cold. "I think he's a man who hates Baxter Thorne, and I happen to be in Thorne's way, nothing more." Sterling left soon after, but Isabella knew he wasn't convinced. He had seen something. Cale, who had watched the entire exchange from a hidden sniper's nest in the rocks above the homestead, knew it too. Sterling had laid his first card. The net was tightening. Their plan had to accelerate. Isabella had discovered Thorne's greatest vulnerability. He was systematically cheating his East Coast investors, skimming profits, and using their money to fund his private army. She had a ledger obtained from a disgruntled clerk she had nursed through a bout of influenza that proved everything. It was their only trump card. The final confrontation was set. Cale sent a message to Thorn, a note delivered by a black arrow into the door of his ranch house. It was a challenge, written in a hand Thorn would recognize as the Ghost's. It named a time and place for a final meeting, midnight at the old abandoned San Pedro mission. Cale knew Thorn's pride would never allow him to refuse. He would see it as a chance to finally kill the Ghost, and Sterling would see it as a chance to trap him. The night of the reckoning was moonless and tense. The mission was a skeleton of adobe walls, a perfect place for an ambush. Cale and his small band of loyal warriors were hidden amongst the ruins. Isabella was not there. She was miles away, riding hard for Prescott, with the ledger ready to deliver it directly to Agent Sterling the moment she got word. Thorn arrived not with a few men, but with a small army of 20 riders, Cutter at his side. They spread out rifles, ready, their nervous whispers echoing in the ruins. But they weren't the only players. On the ridge overlooking the mission, Agent Sterling and a posse of territorial marshals watched, waiting for the Ghost to show himself. Cale began his attack not with a charge, but with chaos. He used his knowledge of the ruins to create diversions, a thrown rock here, a ghostly call there. His warriors, moving like wraiths, picked off Thorn's men, one by one, with silent arrows and knives. The night erupted into a symphony of panicked gunfire, men shooting at shadows. Cale's target was Thorn himself. He cornered the cattle baron in the crumbling bell tower. The fight was brutal and short. Thorn was rich and powerful, but Cale was a survivor, a warrior forged in the crucible of loss. He disarmed Thorn, the man's expensive pistol, skittering across the floor. "This is for all the people whose lives you've destroyed," Cale growled his knife at Thorn's throat. But before he could deliver the final cut, a calm voice called out from the doorway. "Drop the knife. It's over." Agent Sterling stood there, his own pistol leveled. His posse had surrounded the mission. Cale's warriors had already faded back into the night, their part in the plan complete. "He's a murderer and a thief." Cale said, his grip on Thorn unwavering. I know Sterling said his eyes not on Cale, but on Thorn. Miss Rossi delivered a very illuminating piece of evidence to me an hour ago. A ledger. It seems Mr. Thorn here is wanted for fraud on a federal level. His career is over. Sterling's gaze shifted back to Cale. His life, however, is not yours to take. You kill him, and you're no better. You're just another outlaw, and I'll hunt you to the ends of the earth. It was the ultimate choice, the path of vengeance or the path of justice. He looked at Thorn's terrified face, and for a moment he saw the faces of the scalp hunters who had destroyed his world. But then he saw Isabella's face, pleading with him to be the man she knew he was not, the monster they called the Ghost. With a final guttural cry of frustration and release, he shoved Thorn towards Sterling. "He's yours." Cale raised his hands in surrender. The trial of Baxter Thorn was a sensation, but the trial of the Ghost was a quiet, closed affair. With Isabella's testimony about Thorn's persecution and Sterling's own recommendation for leniency, the judge was moved. Cale, whose real name was never entered into the record, was not sentenced to hang. In exchange for providing crucial testimony against the corrupt army officials and politicians on Thorn's payroll, he was given a choice, a lifetime in a federal prison or exile. He was to be escorted to the Canadian border and was never to set foot in the United States again under penalty of immediate execution. He was to die in spirit, if not in body. The Ghost was no more. 1 year later, in a small, quiet valley in the Canadian Rockies, a woman with sun-streaked hair tended a small garden outside a newly built log cabin. The air was cool and smelled of pine, a world away from the dust and heat of Arizona. She looked up as a man walked out of the forest, a brace of rabbits in his hand. His face was hard-won, marked by a scar and a deep sorrow, but his eyes as they met hers were filled with a quiet, peaceful love. Cale dropped the rabbits and pulled Isabella into his arms. They had lost everything, their homes, their pasts, their names. But they had each other. They had forged a new life out of the ashes of the Old Testament, to a love that had been born in an act of mercy, tested in a crucible of violence, and had, against all odds, endured. The legend of El Espectro faded into the whispers of history, just another ghost story told around the campfires of the Old West. But the story of Cale and Isabella is a testament to the fact that even in the most brutal of times, the most powerful force is not vengeance, but a love that refuses to die. It is a reminder that a single act of compassion can change the course of a life, and that even the most feared man can find redemption in the heart of the woman who dared to save him. If their incredible journey from the sun-scorched deserts of Arizona to the quiet hope of a new beginning moved you, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this story with someone who loves epic tales of the untamed West, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more stories of love, loss, and survival from the pages of history. Thank you for listening.